going to turn it over to Dave Claypool to talk a little bit about the history of the survey and sort of provide us with context in terms of the importance of the field notes and how they fit in over time.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. And I know a lot of you, just because of a lot of wear and tear and hours just going through notes and digging and scratching and trying to find stuff. The most marvelous thing about all of this is the cooperative effort by everybody. And that's what makes this work. That's all that makes this work. If that didn't happen, none of this would happen. So thank all of you. Aren't we a good-looking bunch? Minnesota Land, when they did that movie, I don't remember, Minnesota and the Land or whatever it was. Anyway, I was in there. And so I come dressed like this guy because I, many years, worked up north, 8 years up in the big swamps. And you always kept your pants out of the snow because you got wet otherwise. But they made me dress like this. I said, well, I don't know if I'd dress like that. But anyway, that's how we are. And you know, we're little nuts. You're out in the woods. And I've done that. I've done what these guys do. And it's very interesting to retrace this whole system. You push the up button?
The right button.
Okay. Now the reason for this system in the first place has to do with this right here. The Continental Congress couldn't tax. They couldn't do a lot of things. They had no money, so they didn't have any funds for anything. They had no funds for the government to run the rest of the country that we were beginning to fit into, and so on. And they couldn't pay the Revolutionary War soldiers. And up to 1856, where you had a half-breed reservation down in Goodhue, and I only bring that up because it's similar. Script. Script is used a lot to pay people off and to give people things. And in this case, if they had the land. That's all they had was the Northwest Territory. Nothing else could they use to create revenue other than maybe a few items they might make and do and trade. So they decided to survey it and make it into 1 mile squares. We can go into great detail, and it wasn't always like that. But when they got to Minnesota in 1847, they were using this equipment right here. That's all they had. And they surveyed the whole state into 1 mile squares, and they put a post in every half mile. And every half mile they put in a couple of 2 or 4 bearing trees, and they would mark them. And they'd mark them with one of these. So if you were out looking for your homestead, you could physically find it out in the woods, just be the way it was marked by section, township, and range. Now, as I don't have a lot of time, so I can't go into great detail, but if you think about it for a minute, so they got together here in about 1885, they had the Land Ordinance Act. 1886 or so, a bunch of guys got together there and said, well, let's go try this out. And when they got done, they surveyed out 30 different states in the 1 mile squares. Okay? With this equipment right here. Now, they would have a crew along a lot of times to do the things around camp and everything. Keep in mind, in 1803, of course, then we had Louisiana Purchase. So right in front of this survey, we kept purchasing land and taking land or getting the land to belong to the United States. So we just moved across. And we have 2 principal meridians we survey off of. One's a 4th and one's a 5th, and you will see that in your notes when you look at these notes up there. Part of it was because once the Wisconsin Territory was there first, and they used the South line of Wisconsin as a base to do the surveying. And so they come up and grab St. Paul and some of Minneapolis because they didn't have the 5th principal meridian established correctly here yet. Baseline for that's down in Arkansas. But that kind of took care of all the surveys that we, the land that we picked up on the Louisiana Purchase. So that's where they started. Now, John's going to tell you more about what we did with the plats. But the reason I show the plat is because on here is all the work that they did from the field that was drawn up. This is the first document of record in any of your land ownership. If you had an original abstract, the first document in there is a patent. And that patent was based on this plat. This is the first document of title, is the plat. The land was bought off this plat, whichever township it may be. We have 3,600 townships plus. The indexing that folks are doing up there right now, they're looking at every page in those books as they're being scanned and comparing it to the plat down here. So we'll have a cross-reference. John will tell you more. So here we do these plats, and we get these 1 mile squares in here, 36 by 6 miles. And there's already towns out there. Red Wing's there, St. Paul's there, everything's there. The reason that you had guys like Sibley and the guys like Welch being a contractor for all the land inside of a city, for example, was because that city didn't exist, but there were people everywhere in that city. And so one person who had influence would go out and then they would distribute this contracts out on the land parcels that were already being occupied. Okay, so all that was going on. So they did that. So that is your first document in title, right there. Now, you know that, right? You all own some land, you all have a deed. Man, you all got a deed. Somebody's got a deed for the land you're living on. It has a description on it. Might be a whole section of land, 1 mile square. Might be a quarter, it might just be a lot. Okay? So you know it's really important to have good title. Everybody knows that. The best title you can get in Minnesota is registered property, Torrance property. It's not perfect, but it's almost as perfect. Okay, so I got title to my land, right? But where is it? Any of you know where it really is? Only by those notes. These notes that we're doing right now are exactly the work that the surveyors did with this compass and this chain, marking those trees. And it says, one of the first rules, federal rules in federal surveying is that once the property changes from federal ownership to private ownership, and you can't own it until the survey was done, because it had to be bought off the plat. Once it changes, the corners can no longer be changed. They hold forever. So when the surveyor's out there, what they're supposed to be doing is relating all the way back to these notes right here. That's why they're so important. And it may not seem like it, but you still go to those. When I spent 8 years in Beltrami County, I used them every day. I found 70% of everything I looked for land corners, section corners, traceable or original, back to these notes. The only difference between me and some other guys would, I looked for them. They didn't look. So they found an iron in someplace. Now you realize it. Go back to the notes and figure this whole thing out. So I'm going to let John talk about how we preserve the plats and why we're doing the notes. This is the decimal system, so everything in here is points, 3.5, 58.0. There's 20 things that we're supposed to do, minerals, water, people living there, anything that's going on. You can see it all on that plat. If you go back to that plat, you can see all the activity that was there at the time, and they had to show that. So they had 20 different things they did to include the measuring, putting in of the corners, and so on and so forth. And very much like the Doomsday Books in 1085 in England, which they still use today to track their titles. No different. Anything else, John?
David, would you describe the relationship of the notes to the map?
Right.
You didn't unclear about the precedence here.
Right. The relationship of these is all of those plats were drawn from the information on these notes. These notes, the surveyor would go out and survey as a deputy surveyor. All this was contract work, by the way. And the contract work, the deputy surveyor had these instructions to follow, both general and special, and they would go out and do the work. And in this case here, he starts at a corner that's already been established at 1.5 chains, 1.5, there's 100 links in that. The stream, same stream at 3.5, 11.5 is stream, same stream, and he gives the direction it runs. Then he says, I set a post and 2 bur oaks at the quarter corner at a half mile. At 58, he enters a marsh. Marshes were really interesting. It says unfit for cultivation. One of the things I found out when we did the plats was that on some of the plats they have some things in green on the original. That's why we wanted to do them in color. Up north, if you had something in green, that meant you had a grazing area, a place where you had hay without having to clear land. That was really important. Having grown up there, I know how important it was because we just didn't have a lot of land unless you cleared it all. At 71 chains, he leaves that. But he's saying it's unfit for cultivation probably because there's water in it. But that was important. If it was fit for cultivation, then of course the value to that area would be really important. And at 80 chains or a mile, then he sets a corner, and every mile they talk about the land. The land's broken, second rate, timber, oak, and aspen. Okay, every mile they tell you what kind of timber it was. That's why John and Norm and everybody had to use this when we had these U.S. Justice lawsuits that we had to talk about. And then he would continue on. Another mile, land broken, second rate, timber, oak, aspen, undergrowth, hazel, and vines. Now, if they had a lot of undergrowth, you got paid a little bit more.
This computer, for whatever reason, thinks something is amiss.
I almost, when I got there. What you see on there was taken from those notes. So your first document of title is based on the notes, and the place on the face of the earth where your land is taken from the notes. So the plan's fine, they'll give you title, but then you gotta know where it is.